Hey, and welcome back to another video. And in this video, we're actually going to carry on with our integration test, and this time look into our final one, which is the create view model. So before we get started, let's actually just go into our create view model and look at a few test cases that we want to validate. So if I just search for create view model, cool. So looking at our create view model, there's a few things that we want to write tests for. So the first one is we actually want to make sure that when there's an error, it's actually thrown. So when we actually get something has gone wrong, we actually get an error being thrown here. We also want to make sure that we handle successful submission as well within this case here, as well as making sure that any errors that are thrown with our validator are also handled here as well. Cool. So similar to what we've done in our previous integration test videos, we're actually going to need to inject our networking manager via the initializer. But there's also another dependency that we have here, which is our validator here. So we're going to need to actually create a protocol for our create validator so that we can interject a fake version of this within our view model. So let's go into our create validator, and then let's create a protocol here called create validator implementation. Cool, like so. So within this function, we want to define the implementation that it can, use and get capabilities for, and that is our validate function here. Cool. So now any type that implements this protocol will gain this functionality. So let's actually make it conform to this protocol. And you'll see nothing happens just yet, but something will happen when we actually get to the point where we build our own mocks for our validators. Cool. So now that we actually have that in place, we need to update our view model to accept our protocol for our validator and our networking manager. So let's do this now. Let's go back into our create view model. I'm just going to close this to create some space at the top here. And we'll first of all just type out our initializer. So we'll say init, and then we'll say networking manager. And then that will be networking manager implementation. So we want to make sure that's our protocol that we're passing in here. So we can pass in any object that conforms to this protocol. And then we're going to say validator. And that's going to be create validator implementation like so. Then what we want to do now is we actually want to create properties to actually hold what we're about to inject. So rather than actually creating an instance of our validator, instead, let's just turn this into a constant where the type is going to be our create validator implementation, and we can remove where we initialize and create it. And then we want to create another constant here for our networking. So we're going to say let networking manager networking implementation like so. Cool. So now we need to set these. So let's set it. Okay, cool. And then the final thing we need to do with our initializer is actually give these default implementations, because if you build this now, you'll see that you actually get errors because it's expecting to pass these two in. And we only really want to pass, these two in when we actually essentially want to do our integration test or unit test, for example. So we only want to pass this in when we write in our integration test. So here, we're just going to use an instance of our networking manager as a default. And then here, we're just going to use our create validator here as a default as well. So we go into our function. We don't need to actually update our validator, but what we do need to do is update our networking code. So rather than having our networking manager singleton here, we want to replace this with our networking manager like so. So because we're now doing that, we're going to refactor this to use a shared session state. And when we build it, it should be cool, sweet. So now we've got our view model set up where we can essentially just pass in a mocked version of our validator and also as well our networking manager. So now that we've got this all set up, the next thing we need to do is actually start to create our mocks that we're going to use for our unit test. So the first mock that I'm going to create is actually for our networking manager create success. So this is going to simulate a successful request. So let's go here. And then in our networking, we have our mocks. We're going to create a new folder here called create. And then let's create a new Swift file called networking manager create success mock. And then I'm just going to do a bit of typing and then we'll break it down. Cool. So this is our mock. Pause. Cool. So this is our mock for our success when we're using our create view model. So in our request function here, where we actually return something, we're just returning some like standard data. We're actually never going to use this. The one that we care about is this request function here. Now this function doesn't actually return anything, but what it can do instead is actually throws. Now because this is a success, we actually don't want to throw any kind of error. So we're just going to leave this empty like so. So now we created the success, what we need to do now is actually create our validator mock as well to just basically not throw any errors and just simulate a happy path. So in order to do this, we're going to create a new folder in here called create, and then we're also going to create a new group in here called mocks, and then within this group, the first file we're going to create here is called create validator success mock. So I'm just going to do a bit of pause. So what we want to do in here is actually create our mock for our create validator. So in order to do that, we're going to say @testable import. It's going to be the iOS take home project. Cool. And then we're going to create our create validator success mock, which is going to implement the protocol that we just created before. So now you should see when we actually build the project, we should get an error, and that's because we need to implement this protocol stub. Cool. So now this function doesn't actually return anything at all, but it does throws. So what we actually want to do now is basically nothing, because this is a success, so we don't want to throw any errors. We want to simulate as if everything is okay. So now we've got our mock set up for our happy path. Let's actually create our success test within our create folder. So within here, we'll create a new unit test file, and we'll call this create view model success test. Cool. And we actually get a whole lot of obviously template stuff here, so we're going to remove all this so we can just start from scratch. And then what we want to do is we want to actually import our target so we can access those classes that we want to test. So testable import like so. Cool. And then within this class, we're going to set up and tear down. So in our setup and tear down, what we want to do is actually set up our networking manager that we created a second ago. And also as well, we also want to create as well an instance of our, our validator that we're also mocking as well. So let's do this now. So here we're going to say private var, and then it's going to be networking mock like so. And then we're going to have our validation mock. And then we want to do our view model as well. Cool. So now we want to create our setup. And within our setup, we just want to literally just create an instance of each one of these things. So we're going to say, for this, we're going to say we want this to be our networking manager create success mock. And then for our validation mock, we want this to be our create validator success mock like so. And then for our view model, we can now create an instance of this and pass in both of our networking mock and our validator. So let's do that now. So now the next thing we need to do is set up our teardown. And let's just remove that class, we don't want that. And then all we want to do is just set each one of these to nil, like so. Cool, sweet. So now we've got all that set up, we now need to just write our first and let's just make sure we don't forget to put a bang here. Cool. So now that we have that, pause. Cool. So now we have this set up, we now need to write our first test. And the whole point of this class is essentially just to make sure that if we was to make a successful submission, we actually don't get any errors thrown. It just handles it, properly. So let's create a new test. So we're going to say func, and then we're going to say test underscore, and then we're going to say that this is when the, successful responses, when, so we're going to say with this, with a successful response, the submission state is successful. So let's just type this out now. Cool. So within this test, what we want to do is essentially validate that when we actually submit some data, our submission state is successful and no errors are thrown. And any errors that are thrown will be caught by this throws keyword that we have here now. So let's actually just type this out together now. So the first we want to do is make sure that the view model state is nil. So there's actually no state at all. So we're going to say XCassert nil. And then we're just going to check the view model dot state. So that should be nil. I'm going to say the view model cool. And then we're also going to put a defer here so that this runs at the end. And at the end, we're going to basically validate that the state is successful within the view model. And then in order to actually, kick off our flow to actually create a user, we just want to call await view model dot create, like so. Cool. So we can actually test this out now to see if this flow works. And if we just run our test now, cool. So you'll see that our test passes. So now we have our test working for our success path. Now, what we want to do is actually unit test base pause. So what we want to do is actually write tests for when our view model actually fails, so that actually something goes wrong within our view model. Now, it's worth noting that there's actually two things that could go wrong here. So the first thing is that your form that you've actually input some text into is invalid, and also as well, the other error that you could face is that the information that you've actually inputted into pause. The other issue that you could have here is that also as well is that when you actually send a request, the request fails. So we're going to actually create two different test files to handle those two test cases. So the first one we're going to look into is when our form is invalid. So let's actually create a new mock for an invalid form. So we just go into our create folder, and in our mocks, we're going to actually create a create validator failure. And then within this file, I'm just going to do a bit of copy and pasting. So we're going to just copy and paste this and then rename this to be failure mock. Cool. Now within this function, we don't want to actually leave this empty. What we do want to do in here is actually throw some kind of error. So we're going to say throw, and we're going to throw a create validator dot validation error, and that's going to be an invalid first name. So when you use this mock, it's always going to throw that the first name is invalid, which is exactly what we want. So now we have that set up for our validator. We don't actually need to create our networking failure mock just yet, because this isn't unit testing our logic for actually seeing how it handles a failed network request. We're just seeing if our validation fails. So instead, let's create a new unit test file, and we'll call it create view model validation failure tests. Create view model validation failure tests, like so. And let's create that file. Cool. So like we did before, we'll just remove all this template stuff because we're not actually going to be using that. And then we'll just say here at testable import iOS take home project, like so. Cool. So now I'm going to do a bit of copy and pasting to help save some time here. So for our setup and our teardown, we're just going to copy this code here. and then I'm just going to paste that here like so. Cool. So our setup and our teardown is going to be kind of similar, but the only thing that's going to be different is that rather than our success mock being here, we're actually going to use our new validation failure mock instead, because we want to validate and write tests for if this fails. So now that we have this set up, we want to actually write a test to actually validate how, you know, an invalid form gets handled. So let's do that now. Cool. So now we have our test to actually see with an invalid form, the submission state is invalid. So what we want to test here is that our create error, well, our create validator for error is actually thrown here. So let's actually just type this one out together. So similar to before, we're going to validate that our view model state is empty to start off with. Cool. And then after doing that, the next thing we want to do here is our defer to make sure. This time we're going to check to see if our view model state is equal to unsuccessful. Cool. So if you actually go into your view model and look at the state for when things go wrong, you'll see here that we actually set the state here to be unsuccessful. So that's what we should be expecting here. Cool. So let's go back. Cool. So inside of here after this, what we want to do is actually call our function to create a user like so. Sweet. And what we want to do is actually validate if the error that we get back is what we were expecting. So the first we want to do is actually validate that an error was actually thrown. So we're going to check to see if the view model has an error. So we're going to assert that the view model has an error and make sure that this value is the value of this property is actually true. Then the next thing we want to do is actually make sure that there's the error property within our view model is actually not nil. Cool. So after checking that this is not nil, we actually want to check to see if the error is, you know, basically the same as the one that we specifically expect. So we're going to do another XCT assert equal, and we're going to this time check the error, and then this time we're going to compare it against our create. This time we're going to check it against our validation error, and then within here we're going to use our create validator dot create validation error dot invalid name, so it should match this type that we're expecting. And then the message we're going to put here is the view model error should be invalid first name like so. Cool. So when you build it, you'll see that you have an error here, and the reason why is because our validation here doesn't actually conform to the equatable protocol, so we need to fix that. So within our create view model, we need to make sure that our form error conforms to equatable. So let's do that now. So just underneath here, we're going to say extension on create view model dot form error, and then we're going to make that conform to equatable. So we should get a build error now telling us that something's gone wrong, which is fine. So we'll fix that. Cool. Let's delete that. Okay, cool. So now within here, we now want to do a comparison with each one of our, you know, cases to basically say if this equals this, then you should do the following. Cool. So let's type this one out together. So we're going to say switch, and then we're going to want to compare the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So then within here, we're going to say case, And then we're going to do our comparison between the left and right hand side now. So we're going to say parentheses and then networking, and then we're going to say let. And then I just like to say left hand side type. That's what I like to name mine. And then we're going to do the same thing, but the right hand side type. And then within this case, we're now going to do the comparison. So what we want to check here is if the messages, so the localize or the error description we'll use is the same. Cool. So if the error descriptions are the same between those two cases, then we're just going to return true, like so. Cool. So now we need to actually implement this for the rest of our cases. Now, just to help, so let's change this to right hand side type. Cool. So it should say left hand side type is equal to right hand side type, like so. Cool. So now we actually need to implement the rest of our cases. Now, just to help speed this up, I'm just going to copy this, paste it 3 times, and then we're just going to change this to validation, and then we'll change this last one to system. Now the system one isn't actually a localized error, so there's no property on it called error description. So instead we need to create and use, well not create, but we need to use the localized description property. Cool. And then because our switch isn't exhaustive, because we're not actually checking like comparing the networking and validation and so on and so forth, instead what we're going to do is just basically return false if these conditions are not met. Sweet. So now you should see that your project builds properly now and your error should go away. Sweet. So let's actually just test this out and see if this test works. So I'll run this test. Cool, and now our test succeeds. So we have one final test that we need to do now, and that's actually seeing how our app handles when there's actually a networking error. So what we want to do is actually create our mock for when something goes wrong. So let's create a new failure mock within our networking folder here. So within our create folder, we're now going to create our opposite of our success, which is our failure mock. So I'm just going to click this and then select failure. Cool. And then to help speed this up, I'm just going to copy this and then paste it and then rename this file to failure mock. Now in this request function, what we do want to do this time is rather than just leaving it empty, again we want to actually throw some kind of error. So the error I'm going to throw is an invalid URL. So we're going to say NetworkManager dot networking error dot invalid URL. So this will always throw this error. So we need to create a new unit test class because we can't use this validation failure test because we set up our mock in the setup. So instead of doing that, we're going to actually create a new unit test class to actually handle specifically just the networking failing. So let's create a new file and we're going to call this create view model failure test, like so. Sweet. And then I'm just going to copy our success setup and teardown to help speed it up. And I'm just going to say at testable import iOS take home, like so. Then let's take all of this out, replace it with that. So what we do want to do here is we do want our validation to use the success because we don't want to simulate a validation error. But this networking manager here should actually change to the failure one. So it should be a failure mock, like so. Cool. So within this file, what we want to do is actually write out a new function for our test. So let's do that. And our new test that we have is it's going to test to see with an unsuccessful response, the submission state is unsuccessful. Cool. So within here, we're just going to type out what we want to check. So we want to make sure that our state is nil initially. And then we want to defer and then make sure that when we do our check here that our state is equal to unsuccessful. Cool. And then after this, we actually want to call our function to create. So we're going to say await viewModel.create like so. Cool. And then after this, we want to actually validate that there is an error within the view model. So we're going to use our XCT assert true. We're going to say viewModel.has error. And we're just going to say here the view model should have an error. And then we want to validate as well that our error is not nil. Cool. And then the final check we want to do here is we actually want to check to see if the error that we're checking against is the error that we're expecting. So we're going to say XCT assert equal and then error. And then we want to make sure that this is a networking error where the NetworkManager.error is an invalid URL. So we're going to say here the view model error should be a networking error with an invalid URL. Sweet, cool. So let's actually just run this now and see what happens. And you'll see our test passes as well. Cool. So that's actually all of our integration tests sorted for all of our view models that we want to cover so far. So if you enjoyed this video, I'd love to hear your comment in the comment section below. Also as well, if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you gave this video a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to the channel and hit notification bell to get updates for whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you on a bit. Deuces.